Hello, my name is Cecilia, and in the next few slides, I'll be introducing what a quasi-experiment is. The definition is the signature of a quasi-experimental design is the testing of an intervention in the absence of randomization. Randomization is a signature of a true experiment that tests alternative explanations for results. Oftentimes, the control group in a quasi-experiment is called the comparison group, and in order to be considered a strong quasi-experiment, there must be an effort to introduce control mechanisms such as baseline measurements. I included the advantages and disadvantages of this type of study. So the advantage is the practicality of it. So with nursing research, oftentimes it occurs in a natural setting where it can be difficult to deliver an innovative treatment randomly to some people, but not others. The disadvantages is the results are less conclusive. Participants not always willing to be randomized, and causal inferences are not readily made. Okay, so for the next slide, I included two figures from our textbook that shows the differences between qualitative and quantitative studies. So the quasi-experiment is considered a quantitative study. The definition of a qualitative study is that there's an organization and interpretation of narrative data for the purpose of discovering important underlying themes, categories, and patterns. For a quantitative study, it's the organization of numeric data through statistical procedures for the purpose of describing a phenomena or testing the magnitude and reliability of the relationships among them.
Hey everyone, so for this portion of the slides, we'll be just discussing a little bit more about quasi-experimental research and going over the steps of this research design. So quasi-experimental research is a method that sits at the intersection of experimental and non-experimental approaches. In quasi-experiments, we aim to uncover causal relationships in situations where random assignments may be challenging or maybe even impractical. So now let's break down the essence of quasi-experimental research. Unlike traditional experimental designs where participants are randomly assigned to groups, quasi-experimental studies work with existing groups, making it especially useful in real-world settings where randomization might be logistically difficult or even ethically questionable. In quasi-experimental research, we're not manipulating the independent variable as rigorously as in true experiments. Instead, we capitalize on naturally occurring variations or pre-existing groups. This method allows us to examine cause and effect relationships, though with a little bit more nuance. So our focus today will be on a specific quasi-experimental study. So let's dive into the intricate steps involved in this research method and how they unfold in the study. Now let's take a closer look at the systemic steps involved in conducting a quasi-experimental research. Our journey begins with the identification of variables and the definition of the relationships we aim to explore. Unlike traditional experiments where random participants assignments is the norm, quasi-experimental studies carefully select participants, often using methods like matched pairs or statistical controls to enhance comparability. The next critical step involves pre-testing or the measure that initial status of participants. Following this baseline assessment, we implement the treatment or intervention under study. Post-testing then comes into play, allowing us to assess changes and variations after the intervention. This sequential approach is instrumental in understanding the impact of the treatment over time. Now let's dive onto the matter of the heart, the data analysis. Rigorous statistical methods are employed to scrutinize the collected data, and this involves comparing pre- and post-intervention measurements, accounting for any pre-existing differences among participants. The goal is to discern whether the observed changes can be attributed to the intervention or if other factors may be at play. And as we move toward drawing conclusions, it's important to acknowledge that inherent limitations of quasi-experimental research. The absence of randomization introduces potential for biases, and researchers must tread very carefully in attributing causality. Nevertheless, the method offers valuable insights, especially when random assignments is impractical or ethically challenging.
Study example. Study title: Impact of simulation-based training on trauma team performance in a Level 1 trauma center. Summary: in this Quasi experimental study, researchers aim to assess the impact of simulation-based training on trauma team performance in a Level 1 trauma center. The study involved multiple convenience samples, including nurses attending specific training, resident physicians, and trauma clinicians. The study treated each trauma team as a subject evaluating their collective performance. Application of Quasi experimental design. Study design. Quasi experimental pre or post-intervention design. Setting: Level 1 trauma center. Convenience samples: different group of healthcare professionals involved in trauma care. Comparison to prior outcomes. Historical data used for comparison at specific time point. Treatment initiation. Introduce of simulation-based training. Team as a subject. Collective evaluation of trauma teams. Power calculation. Determination of a sample size based on statistical power consideration. In this example, the Quasi experimental design allows researchers to assess the impact of the simulation-based training in a real-world trauma care setting, considering the complexity and the ethical consideration associated with random assessment in such a context.
Hi everyone, my name is Claudia and today I'll be discussing the challenges and limitations of using a quasi-experimental research. So, quasi-experimental designs differ from randomized controlled trials in that participants are not randomly assigned to groups. This lack of randomization introduces several challenges that can impact the validity and interpretation of study results. We'll begin by discussing the lack of randomization. In quasi-experimental designs, one of the primary challenges is the absence of randomization, which is considered the signature of a true experiment. Unlike randomized controlled trials, where participants are randomly assigned to different groups, quasi-experimental designs lack this random assignment. This absence possesses a significant challenge in establishing a cause and effect relationship. Another challenge in a quasi-experimental design is the potential for selection bias. Since participants are not randomly assigned to intervention and control groups, systematic biases may influence group membership. This introduces a source of bias that can impact the internal validity of the study. Furthermore, a critical aspect of research is internal validity, which refers to the extent to which observed effects are due to the manipulation and not other factors. Achieving internal validity is more difficult in quasi-experimental designs because of the lack of randomization. Researchers face a challenge of enduring that observed effects can be attributed to the intervention rather than confounding variables. Additionally, establishing causal relationship becomes more complex in a quasi-experimental research. These designs often present numerous alternative explanations for the observed results, making it challenging to draw firm conclusions about the cause and effect. And at last, ethical considerations also come into play in quasi-experimental designs. When certain groups are excluded from a treatment condition, ethical concerns may arise, particularly if the treatment is believed to be beneficial. This exclusion raises questions about fairness and the potential impact on those excluded from the intervention. Now, while quasi-experimental designs offer valuable insights, researchers must be aware of and address the challenges associated with lack of randomization, selection bias, validity concerns, and ethical considerations. On the next slide, I'll be discussing the limitations of using a quasi-experimental research. All right, so a crucial limitation in studies without randomization, which is considered the signature of a true experiment, is the inability to ensure that groups are equivalent at the outset. This lack of equivalence opens the door to potential confounding variables that can influence the results. Another significant limitation is selection bias. Just like it's a challenge, it also presents itself as a limitation. In the absence of random assignment, self-selection may lead to non-equivalent groups, making it challenging to attribute observed differences to the treatment rather than pre-existing differences. This introduces a source of bias that can affect the study's internal validity. Now, validity concerns arise due to the presence of confounding variables and other threats to internal validity in studies lacking randomization. These factors compromise the ability to draw a clear conclusion about the impact of the independent variable. While researchers can make educated inferences, they cannot assert causation as strongly as in true experimental designs. And lastly, ethical constraints possess a limitation in studies without randomization. Random assignment and manipulation of variables, common in true experimental designs, may be limited by ethical considerations. This limitation adds an additional layer of complexity to the design and implementation of studies. It's clear that the lack of randomization in research designs bring about limitations in terms of group equivalence, potential selection bias, compromised internal validity, and ethical constraints. Understanding and acknowledging these limitations are essential for researchers to interpret and communicate their findings accurately. Thank you.